And Willemijn, are you there?
I am here.
Oh, there you are. Thank you so much for being here. Willemijn, you should be able to share your screen.
I think it's possible. Yes, that should be fine.
Thank you so much for being here. Without further ado, it is my great honor and pleasure and delight to introduce Willemijn Waal, who is lecturer in Assyrian and Hittite studies at the University of Leiden. And she's also the newly appointed director of the NINO, the Netherlands Institute for the Near East. Unfortunately, she was appointed just before the pandemic stroke, so she's been working online and remotely since then. And it is fantastic to have her here for yet another remote meeting. I know that you're quite tired of all this telematic stuff, and I completely agree with you. It would have been wonderful to have you here, but it's impossible. Willemijn is known for her very daring and provocative work, and she has taken on a subject today that she will be presenting, which is incredibly hot as a topic and incredibly debated. But she's also a many interest person. She not only is an expert in the Hittites and late Bronze Age Anatolia, but she's an expert in ancient writing systems, especially from the 1st and 2nd millennium BC. And she's also very keen on researching on the interface between orality and literacy. And she's also an expert in the Anatolian hieroglyphs, on which she's written two very interesting and very provocative articles, because they seem to subvert our view of the origins of the Anatolian hieroglyphs. And in the same note and in the same spirit, today she will be presenting on the subject of the Greek alphabet with the title, which is very enticing, Older Than It Appears, New Perspectives on the Origins of the Greek Alphabet. As you know, Scribo has had so many long discussions after the presentations. So you are very welcome to ask questions to Willemijn after her presentation. And I'm sure she will be willing to stay with us till the end to answer your questions. Before I leave the floor to you, let me just announce our next speaker for Scribo on Wednesday, the 29th of July, is going to be Christian Prager from the University of Bonn, who's going to be talking about the Maya script. And his title is The Study of Maya Hieroglyphic Writing in the Digital Age, a Work Report. So 3D models, I think, will be the topic, another hot topic. So please join us then in 2 weeks' time, 29th of July. We will be posting the link very soon, and a new poster that Miguel Valerio will be devising. Miguel, who is present here today, together with all the Scribo collaborators who work under the aegis of the Inscribe ERC project, are here today. And I'm sure that they will be asking very interesting questions at the end of Willemijn's talk. Thank you so much all for being here. Willemijn, over to you. If there are any technical glitches, we're here to address them.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this lovely introduction and for inviting me. I'm very happy and honored to be here, and also for organizing this wonderful series of lectures. I've not been able to attend all of them, but those that I have, I enjoyed tremendously. So I think it's a really wonderful initiative. Okay, now I will try to share my screen. As Sylvia mentioned, I would like to talk today about the origins of the Greek alphabet and the $1 million question, when the alphabet was introduced to Greece. And while much has been written about it, it's, as Sylvia said, a hotly debated topic, but you can more or less distinguish two main schools, two main points of view. On the one hand, within the field of classical studies, it is generally held that the Greeks took over the alphabet from the Phoenicians somewhere in the 8th or the late 9th century, and that they then modified it by introducing vowel signs. And this model ultimately goes back to a very influential article of Rice Carpenter in the American Journal of Archaeology of 1933. On the other side, within the field of Semitic studies, it generally held that the alphabet was introduced to Greece already much earlier, already in the 11th century BC. And a great proponent of this theory was Joseph Nave in the 70s, and also already Ullmann in 1934, who responded to the paradigm of Carpenter. Needless to say, on both sides, there are exceptions. There are classicists who argue for an earlier date, and vice versa. Semitic scholars who argue for a later date. Overall, one can say that the first scenario is now the one that is most commonly accepted, but well, I think there are some recent discoveries and new insight that force us to consider an earlier introduction date of the alphabet. Well, and today I would first like to start with a brief historical background, probably not necessary for most of you, and then move on to the main arguments for an earlier introduction of the Greek alphabet. That includes the epigraphic evidence, the characteristics of the Greek alphabets, the relations with Etruscan and Phrygian alphabets, also the text genres of the earliest Greek inscriptions, and the new insights and discoveries. And then I will briefly address the famous argument from silence and end with some conclusions and implications of the paradigm I'm going to propose here. Well, in the late Bronze Age, as I'm sure you all know, many writing systems were in use. The cuneiform script might be the best known, or at least the best attested, because it was written on the durable material clay that was written in large regions all over the ancient Near East. Egypt, of course, had its own hieroglyphic writing system. In Anatolia, they made use of cuneiform script, but they also had their own indigenous Anatolian hieroglyphic script. Writing was going on in Cyprus, and also in the Aegean, various writing systems were in use, the most important ones being the Cretan hieroglyphs, Linear A and Linear B. Well, along with all these writing systems, the alphabet coexisted. Now we know that the alphabet was in use already from the early 2nd millennium onwards. The oldest attestations that we have date from around 1900 till 1800 BC. They stem from Wadi al-Hol in Egypt. And other early inscriptions include inscriptions from the Sinai region and Palestine. And they are usually dated somewhere between the 19th and 15th century BC. Their dating is quite debated and uncertain, and I must say that will apply for more of the dates I will be mentioning here. Well, these very early inscriptions, which I will refer to as early Vessemetic during this talk, they are a consonantal alphabetic or abjad writing, meaning that they do not have vowel signs. And in these very early inscriptions, you see that the letter shapes are quite unstable, and the writing direction is also not yet fixed. So they're written from left to right, right to left, boustrophodon vertically, horizontally. So basically they are all over the place. And these very early inscriptions, they're not completely understood, but it's generally agreed that they can be seen as forerunners of later consonantal scripts, such as the Phoenician script. We also have alphabetic writing attested in cuneiform in the late Bronze Age at the site of Ugarit, located right here. It's attested from around 1400 till 1180 BC. And it's written, you see that every cuneiform sign here represents one letter, and you see here below one of the earliest ABCDeries. And it's interesting to see that already the letter order, which is very familiar to us, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, our later Alpha, Beta, Gamma, was already established back then. There was also a competing word order, the so-called Halacham order. And we now know, thanks to the work of Ben Haring, that was also already in use in the 15th century BC. So what we see is that the cuneiform was used, and probably much more extensively than we can judge from the evidence available to us, because the fact that we already have such fixed standardized word orders implies that it was part of a well-established tradition. Well, if we then move on to the Iron Age, we see the Phoenician, Aramaic, and Hebrew alphabets. And well, somewhere in the 11th century, it's also a bit debated exactly when, we see some standardization of the writing, that the writing direction gets stabilized, and also the letter shapes. And in the case of Phoenician, we see that it's from then onwards written from right to left in scriptural continua. Well, if we now move to the earliest Greek alphabetic attestations, they first appear in the 8th century BC. And when they first appear, they immediately turn up in a large geographic area, in the Greek mainland, also the Greek islands, and also in Italy and the west coast of Anatolia. And altogether, we can distinguish 33 different alphabetic variants right from the very start. And these local scripts, they are clearly different. We can really see, they're really different traditions, but at the same time, they also share some common innovations. And the most important one is the fact that they all have the vowel signs. So that means that in the end, they must go back to the same ancestor. You see here, well, these 33 different local scripts, they have been subdivided in 3 or 4 main groups. By Kirchhoff, so-called the blue alphabets that are spread mostly in the eastern region, and then they have also the light blue variants on the islands, the green alphabets in Crete and the Cyclades Islands, and the red alphabets more to the west. Well, if we now turn to the epigraphic evidence, the shapes and the forms of the letters, they have played a very central role in the whole debate about the date of the Greek alphabet. And in a way that's a bit unfortunate, because actually the comparison of individual letter shapes is not a very reliable method, especially in this case. And that is mainly due to the fact that, well, we have very few attestations at our disposal. I mean, the corpus of early inscriptions is quite limited. And therefore, if we have the attestation of one sign, it's very uncertain how long it was already in use before that time and afterwards. So basically our material is too limited to draw sound conclusions. There are also a lot of chronological uncertainties with respect to the dating of these early inscriptions. And last but not least, there's also quite an amount of subjectivity involved when comparing letter shapes. And actually the same letter forms have been used on, as an argument for both sides. For example, here you see to the left a chart made by Joseph Nave, who sees much more resemblance between the Greek alphabet and the very early Vessemetic signs. And whereas on the other hand, this chart comes from Daniels and Bright, they see much more resemblance with the later Phoenician alphabet. And it must be said on both sides, conclusive arguments have been refuted by later discoveries, because it turned out that a certain sign form was in fact longer in use or already earlier in use than was previously thought. So all in all, it's not a very reliable and a very subjective affair. But we are a bit more on firm ground if we look at the scribal habits in general, such as, for example, the direction of writing. If we look at these very early Greek inscriptions that we have, well, they do not have any fixed writing order. They are basically all over the place, left to right, vertical, horizontally, etc., etc. And well, we've just seen that actually the Phoenician writing stabilized somewhere in the 11th century. It was written from right to left. Whereas these early Vessemetic material actually a bit from until somewhere around 1050 BC could be written in any direction. So if you assume that the Greeks took over the alphabet from the Phoenicians somewhere in the 9th or 8th century, that would mean that they sort of ignored the Phoenician standardization of the alphabet and instead turned to a less developed writing style. And also ended up writing in the complete opposite direction, because, well, Phoenician is written from right to left, and Greek in the end will be written from left to right. Well, this argument is usually explained by saying that the experimenting in writing tradition is actually quite typical for early writing systems, which is indeed true for newly created writing systems, and there you often see that they are all over the place in the beginning. But it's actually not so common if you take over an already existing standardized writing system. If you look, for example, at a cuneiform that has been introduced to many different cultures, and then you see that along with the script, certain scribal conventions are taken over as well, including the direction of writing. Well, another typical feature of these early Greek inscriptions is that they make use of word divisions. And this can be done by multiple dots or by vertical strokes. You see, for example, here to the left or to the right, that is the Nestor cup, which is one of the earliest inscriptions that we date to around 750 BC. That has, I seem to have made a yellow scratch on my screen. I'm not sure if you can see it as well. Anyway, you can see.
Yes, we can see it, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, I'll try to make it more.
It's okay.
But you see, I'm now afraid to touch the screen, but you see these multiple dots as word division. And these kinds of word divisions, so multiple dots and vertical lines, are also found in the early Vessemetic inscriptions. For example, to the left, you see an inscription from the 13th century from Lachis, and there you also see the same division with multiple dots. But afterwards, these kind of word divisions are no longer attested. So here again, well, you can think of two scenarios. So either the Greeks took over the alphabet in the 9th or 8th century and, well, basically ignoring the existing Phoenician writing conventions and, well, ending up mimicking those that were in use before that time. Or, well, Occam's razor, the more simpler solution would be actually that they simply took over the existing habits, and that would mean that they also took over the alphabet much earlier, so somewhere in the 11th or 10th century BC. Of course, since our material, the evidence is so limited, we cannot exclude that certain old scribal habits continue to be used after the 10th century BC, but that still would have meant that the Greeks would have ignored the standardization of the Phoenician script, because that was already, it already existed from the 11th century onwards. Well, if we now move to the pluriformity of letter forms, as I mentioned, there's a great variety in the letter shapes. They're not yet standardized. But as said, well, since they also share some common innovations, such as the vowel signs, they are present in all the Greek alphabets. It means that they must go back to a common origin. So how do we explain the fact that we have such a variety in letter shapes and forms? Well, you could argue that it must mean that the prototype also had unstable letter forms. That's the argument of Joseph Nave, who therefore says, well, that's one of the arguments that it must have been an early introduction when the Vessemetic script was also still unstabilized. Or you could argue that this variety in letter shapes is due to local developments, but that actually would also imply an early introduction. It would mean that writing was already going on in Greece before the first attestations. Or, and that's basically what we're assuming now in the current paradigm, it must have been extremely rapid diversion. So it was in a very short amount of times, these letter forms multiplied. And it's not only the letter forms that show variety, but as mentioned, there are 33 different regional alphabets. And again, well, they share the innovations such as the vowel signs. That means that they must go back to a common ancestor, but there are also clearly some substantial differences already from the very start. And these are most visible with respect to the extra signs phi, psi, chi, and xi, which are not present in all the alphabets and sometimes also have different sound values. And another feature are the sibilants, the distribution of sun and sigma. None of the Greek alphabets has both sun and sigma retained. They also have all have chosen either for sun to represent the S or sigma. So it's an either or situation. And here again, we have to wonder, so because, well, when the first Greek inscriptions appear, all these differences are in place. We have these different traditions, but are these the results of a longer development? Or do we have to assume an extremely rapid divergence? Another thing is, as I mentioned, well, when these first inscriptions appear in the 8th century, they immediately appear in quite a large geographic area. So in the mainland of Greece, the Greek islands, Italy, and the islands around Italy, and the west of Anatolia. And this sudden explosion of all this writing everywhere has been dubbed the Alphabetic Big Bang. And this actually is one of the main points of critique uttered by Ullmann in 1934 in this paradigm, that he said, well, a lot of things must have happened very quickly. And well, it's worthwhile to quote him. Between the introduction of the alphabet into Greece and the earliest extant inscriptions, many developments took place. The assumption that the alphabet was not introduced until 700 BC, at the time that Carpenter wrote his article in 1933, the earliest Greek attestations dated to 700, we're now back to 800 BC, reminds one of a hothouse which accelerates the growth of plants. In no time at all the letters changed their shape. Semitic vowels split into consonant digamma and vowel upsilon. The added letters were invented. The so-called Western and Eastern alphabets were differentiated. It is no wonder that Carpenter sets forth a schedule for its development. Everything has to move on schedule if it is to be accomplished. It's also worthwhile to quote the reaction of Carpenter to this critique of Ullmann, because I think it's quite telling in a number of ways. He says the following: "My critics have deemed it absurd that this wonderful invention for recording and preserving unbodied speech should have spread like wildfire down the trade routes and along the seaways of enlightened Hellenic thought, reaching Corinth in a single generation and distant Etruria in less than 50 years. But for myself, I hold it worse than absurd. I hold it un-Greek and hence unthinkable that it should have lingered for any considerable lapse of time among this intensely active people in passive abeyance, known but unutilized. Truly, the Greek climate does miracles to a young alphabet. We can almost see it growing." Well, this quote of Carpenter received a lot of criticism, and people like, for example, Martin Bernal has also read this in the context of intensifying anti-Semitism. Well, we are talking about the 1930s, after all. And that is probably pushing the argument too far, and certainly do not want to accuse Carpenter of any racist motives, but it must be said that this whole praising of the Greek feels a bit uncomfortable, if only because it implicitly sets aside the Phoenicians as these lazy, less active people who just whose alphabets developed in a more natural pace. But most of all, I think this shows how much the current paradigm is the product of a very Hellenocentric way of thinking, and that the Greeks were really seen as exceptional and as different from their surrounding people, and but exceptional, the idea of the Greek legend, etc., and this idea of a cultural superiority of the Greeks that is, of course, undemonstrated. And this whole Eurocentric, Hellenocentric way of looking at history is, of course, now outdated. But even setting aside all these, well, the political agendas, etc., I think this is also not a very satisfying explanation from an academic point of view, because basically Ullmann, well, rightly says that it's quite problematic that so many things happened so incredibly quickly. And then basically, yeah, the response is, well, that it was possible because the Greeks were such intensely active people, which is, I think, not very satisfying, and these facts deserve a better explanation. If we now move to the Etruscan and Phrygian alphabets, the Etruscan alphabet is first attested probably somewhere in the early 7th century BC. And here we see that the alphabet, it resembles the so-called Greek red alphabet, so the Western alphabets, but there are also differences from the very start. And well, the most important one is the fact that the Etruscan alphabet has both the letters sigma and san to indicate the sibilants, whereas in the Greek alphabets, the alphabets have chosen either for sigma or for san. There's no Greek alphabet that has both these letters. So that means that it was usually assumed that the Etruscan took over the alphabet from the Greeks when both these sibilants were still in use, which also implies an earlier use of the alphabet, because as soon as we have the first attestations, it's an either-or situation with respect to sigma and san. Well, the Phrygian alphabet, there has been an important redating of the Gordian material. And so now the first inscriptions that we have date to around 800 BC. So they're contemporary or even a bit earlier than the earliest Greek inscriptions. And for a long time, it was thought that they dated to a later period. And here, well, we see actually a similar picture that the Phrygian is quite similar to the Greek alphabet, but it's also clearly different. There are some elements in there that the Greek alphabet does not have. And what is more, when these first inscriptions appear, they already seem to be part of a well-established writing tradition. So scholars, for example, like Claude Brix, assume that writing the Phrygian alphabet must have been in use already before the first attestations. So in some we see that, well, apart from the differences within the Greek alphabets, there are also three related yet clearly independent alphabetic scribal traditions in place. So the Greek, well, with all its variants, the Etruscan and the Phrygian. And at the one hand, we see that they share these similarities, mainly the addition of vowel signs, which imply that they must go back to a common ancestor. But at the same time, they really have very clear differences that can only be explained as the outcomes of longer separate developments. If we now move to the earliest inscriptions and their content, we see that all the earliest Greek material till around 650 BC or so is all of a private and popular nature. They mainly consist of owner inscriptions on pottery and some graffiti, mainly of an erotic nature from Santorini, and also some poetry lines on pottery. And this is actually quite interesting to see, because this implies actually that the use of script was already quite broadly spread and under the population. So it was not just used for example, for trade or administrative purposes, but also for more playful and private occasions. And it has already been observed, for example, by Theodorson, that it's actually quite a rapid spread among the population. And this rapid spread is even more remarkable, actually, if you think that in the current paradigm we have just come out of a dark age of some 300 years without any writing. The Linear B ends around 1180 BC, and then the first inscriptions we have again from the Aegean are these alphabetic inscriptions. So it would mean that we have an extremely long dark age, and then all of a sudden an explosion, and writing was used for all kinds of purposes. Well, as I mentioned, some of these early texts are of a poetic nature. They are metric lines, some of them resembling Homer. And if we look at, we have only a few examples, but if you look at their geographic distribution, it is interesting to see that they also are quite broadly spread. It's not that they all come from, they're centered around Athens. We have the Ischia cup that is found at Ischia, an little island near the coast of Naples. We also have the Dipylon vase from Athens, and a relatively recent discovery of the Alexander cup dating around 700 BC all the way to the north. So you see that this use of the alphabet for poetry was, at least if you look at it geographically, quite widely spread. And the fact that the very first inscriptions include these poetry lines, these metric verses, has led some people, such as Barry Power, to conclude that writing was introduced to record Homer. And this theory has received a lot of criticism, but it's still not completely disappeared, because I think it still appeals to a lot of people, and in a way that's understandable, because it's quite a romantic, attractive idea that writing would have been invented to record poetry. It is then usually forgotten that actually the very first material also includes this quite crude pornographic graffiti on rocks, which is really much less refined and artistic. And actually both the recording of poetry and the recording of pornographic graffiti are not commonly the most evident primary use of writing. It's usually writing is first used for other purposes, for example, administrative or religious, and only in a later phase it started to be used for like for poetry or for graffiti, etc. So based on the material at hand, you could also argue for a much less romantic and much more pragmatic scenario. And that is actually that writing was already in use before we have the first attestations for other text genres. And then the great difference is that from the 8th century onwards, when writing also comes to be used to record ownership of pots, or for poetry and for graffiti on rocks, that's for the first time the script is used on durable materials, and therefore it has survived. Whereas the other text genres, well, they are lost because they were written on perishable materials. We have some indirect evidence that writing was already in use for other purposes than ownerships and graffiti and poetry. For example, Strabo mentions the recording of city laws and of Olympic winners from in the 8th century. That would imply indeed that writing was also used for other purposes. Well, as I said, there have been some, well, new is a relative term, but at least some new insights and discoveries after the current paradigm was launched in 1933. And first of all, our perspectives on the Dark Age have changed tremendously in the last decades. For a long time, it was thought that the Iron Age was a very gloomy period, which was one of complete decline, and that Greece was completely isolated. And now it is clear that although certainly there was also a change and decline, there was also a fair amount of continuity and prosperity as well, especially at places like Knossos and Lefkandi. And we also see that the connections with the ancient Near East continued. So it was not all dark, isolated, and gloomy. Another thing that happened after Carpenter wrote his article in 1933 is the decipherment of Linear B. In 1952, Michael Venters proved that the Linear B was used to record Mycenaean, which is an early form of Greek. So we now know actually that Greek was already written for at least 2 centuries in the Aegean before the introduction of the alphabet. So actually there was already an established literary tradition. And well, I already briefly mentioned it earlier. The current paradigm is based on quite a Hellenocentric, Eurocentric model. And in this model, basically the West, which included Greece, is seen as the only agent in history, and the rest of the world is seen as, well, basically as passive bystanders. And this is very much fits the current paradigm, where the Greeks have a crucial role in the distribution and development of the alphabet. But I think, well, I hope we can all agree that this Eurocentric way of looking at history has become outdated, and so it might also be time actually to adjust the paradigm, which still has some traces of this way of thinking in it. Well, in addition, there have actually been quite some, well, relatively a lot of new discoveries since the 1930s. We have a growing number of early alphabetic inscriptions. For example, the very early inscriptions from Egypt are quite recent. So now we know actually that the alphabet was already in use from the early 2nd millennium onwards, so much earlier than was long thought. And also the material of early Greek inscriptions has been steadily growing, and the date of the earliest text from Greece has already been pushed back some 100 years since Carpenter, which you could say is, well, clearly shows how dangerous it can be to only argue from the material that you have at hand. Well, and that brings me to well, the argument from silence, which is you could say basically the only argument that is still standing from the paradigm of Carpenter, the fact that we do not have any inscriptions before the 8th century BC. In a way, the silence is not very surprising in this case, because we know that the dominant writing materials for alphabetic writing are perishable materials, such as, for example, leather, wood, or papyrus, which, well, we cannot expect to survive, and well, still today we often use paper. And this in contrast, for example, to cuneiform that was very much tied to the durable material clay. And so therefore we see that this silence does not only occur in Greece, but basically everywhere in regions where the alphabetic writing was used. It's because the material is less durable, less material has survived. And well, a good case in point to see that the absence of writing doesn't necessarily mean that no writing was going on. Maybe the case of Cyprus, where we see, well, clearly continuity between the Cyprian writing system and the later Cyprian syllabary, but there is an absence of any writing from around 950 or so to the 8th century. So that goes to say that, I mean, the absence of evidence does not always mean that no writing was going on. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I would like to argue that, well, it's clearly that we see a change in the 8th century. All of a sudden have these inscriptions, but that they do not so much reflect the beginning of alphabetic writing in Greece, but rather an expansion of the use of writing. And that from the 8th century onwards, the writing was more penetrated into society, and it became to be used for private purposes, so for more playful things like poetry or ownerships on vases. And before the time, well, and afterwards as well, it was also used on more perishable materials for all kinds of other records, but these simply have not survived. So all in all, if you put it all together, we've seen that the Greek alphabet shares some characteristics with the early Vessemetic inscriptions before around 1050 or so, such as the unfixed writing directions, the instability and variety of the letter forms, and the use of word dividers. And in addition, I think you can say that if you assume an earlier transmission of the Greek alphabet, actually a lot of facts that are, well, a bit awkward or unexplained in the current paradigm are actually now fit quite nicely. Well, they include the fact that we, right from the very start, have these 33 different distinct alphabetic traditions, which is really quite exceptional. Well, and the fact that they have such a variety, and well, that it's not only the Greek alphabets that have different traditions, but that we also have the Phrygian and Etruscan alphabet in place, and that we see that they are clearly different, though also clearly related. And the fact that we have the alphabet all of a sudden attested everywhere in all over Greece, Italy, and Anatolia, and the fact that it was right from the start used for purposes that normally are not, or at least not commonly, primary use of writing, such as erotic graffiti and poetic verses. And if you assume an earlier introduction, it would actually also mean that the developments in Greece would have been quite similar actually with those in the surrounding regions, and of which we now know they actually were in contact. So that would make sense. And it would also mean that there was no exceptionally long dark age without any writing in the Aegean, which, if you think about it, is actually quite exceptional, because we know that for over half a millennium, writing was in use in the Aegean. And then all of a sudden you would have a completely illiterate phase of some 300 years, whereas in all the surrounding regions, writing was going on. And we know now that they were in connection with these regions. And it would also fit these new insights that actually the Dark Age was not as dark as we assumed. So it was not all gloomy and all decline, but actually there was quite some continuity and prosperity. I would like to briefly mention that, well, there's actually an early introduction would also be attractive from a linguistic perspective. Kees Ruig has argued for an earlier date of the alphabet. He wants to push it back to around the 10th century BC, because he feels that would better explain some of the Greek modifications of the Phoenician alphabet from a linguistic perspective. And to my knowledge, there are no linguistic arguments that support a later introduction date. And well, you may have seen it because it received some media attention. Only 2 months ago, an important article has appeared in PLOS ONE by Stefanos Dimatsidis and Bernard Leninger, who basically challenged the current dating of the early Iron Age Aegean chronology. And they propose actually that this date needs to be pushed back significantly, some 100 to 150 years. Well, I'm not an archaeologist, so I will only briefly summarize what their main point is. If I understand correctly, the current chronology is mainly based on historical dates, and there's only very limited and apparently not very reliable radiocarbon evidence available. And now at the site of Syndos in the north of Greece, in Thessaloniki, they have for the first time a continuous sequence of C14 dates, and they're based on short-lived samples of animal bones in this case. So for the first time, they have a reliable sequence of radiocarbon dates. And their data seem to show that, well, that the whole early that the whole thing has to be pushed backwards, and that especially in the late Geometric 1 period, actually, well, it's not only started much earlier, but also lasted much longer. And this Geometric 1 period is an important transformative phase, in which basically the whole colonial expansion to the west and the distribution of the alphabet is to have taken place. And it's now all dated in a very short period of time, only 1 or 2 generations. And they argue that this period must in fact have been much longer, some 130 to 140 years, which would mean that all these developments, including the spread and development of the alphabet, may have taken place in a much longer period, and which also already started much earlier. And this would actually quite nicely fit in the new paradigm that I would like to suggest. Because, well, I would like to move away from the paradigm of Carpenter and instead argue that the introduction of the alphabet took place much earlier, already around 1050 or so, and so before its first attestations. Well, if these new datings are correct, actually the gap without attestations would be much smaller, because it would, I mean, if we date back to geometric material, the first inscriptions would also be older than we now assume. And that the first records were written down on perishable materials and therefore have not come down to us. And this new paradigm, I think, would allow us to give some new insight in some long-standing unresolved issues. I would like to briefly highlight two. These are, first of all, the relations between the Greek and as we call the other Western alphabets, such as the Phrygian, the Etruscan, but also the other Anatolian alphabets, the Italic and the Paleo-Hispanic alphabets, and last but not least, the Homeric question. Well, first, these relations between the Greek and the alphabets, well, I call them Western alphabets. It's mainly in the current paradigm, we see that the Phoenician, Greek was sort of the mother of the Greek alphabet, and then the Greek alphabet added the vowel signs, and then basically all alphabets that have vowel signs must have been derived from the Greek. So that means all the Italic alphabets, the Anatolian ones, etc., etc. But actually, this paradigm is quite problematic for many of these alphabets, especially in some cases in the Anatolian, for Carian, for example, the alphabet, we see that there is a mismatch between the sound values of the Greek alphabet and the sound values they have in Carian. And actually, in all of these cases, it's really difficult to pinpoint a clear Greek ancestor. And in all cases, there are problems or unresolved issues. And so therefore, we might want to consider a different model in which Greek is not so much the mother of all the alphabets that have vowel signs, but rather a sister, and that maybe some form of one or more alphabets that already had vowel signs circulated much earlier. And we know that the Northwest Semitic alphabets that are, well, basically consonantal, they could also make use of so-called matres lectionis, sort of vowel signs, for example, to write down foreign names. And actually this system is quite comparable to the later Greek vowel sign systems. So one can imagine that actually vowels were already written down, and it of course very much depends on the kind of language you want to write down, how relevant it is, whether or not to include vowel signs. So we could think of a scenario, which I think it was also something that Pippa addressed during her talk in her series, that we should maybe think of this relationship in a less static way, but they could have been more fluid. And this kind of scenario where actually the Greeks are not necessarily the only inventors of the vowel signs might explain a lot of the unexplained issues we have at hand at the moment. And then last but not least, the Homeric question. Well, it's a long-standing debate about the date and the creation and the transmission of the Homeric Epics. It is usually thought that they were composed orally and then transmitted orally and written down on only at a later stage. But this scenario is problematic for a number of reasons, and especially in the last decades, it has become clear that a lot of elements that were thought to be typically oral, actually, such as, for example, the use of formulae, can actually also occur in written language, and that the distinction between oral and written is much more fluid than we might like or want to think. And quite recently, I think Rainer Friedrich has shown quite convincingly that we cannot think of Homer as a strictly oral composition, and that must have been some element of literacy involved. And in that respect, it's quite interesting to look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think it has often been pointed out that the Epic of Gilgamesh bears a lot of resemblance to the Homeric Epics, not only with respect to the content, the themes they discuss, think of Patroclus and Achilles and Enkidu and Gilgamesh, but also with respect to their style and structure, the way it's organized, the use of epitheta, of repeated formulae, of direct speech. It's this repetition and the typical scenes, etc. I mean, there are very similar epics in many ways. And well, in the case of Gilgamesh, we are fortunate that we can more or less retrace the history of this epic, and we know that it ultimately goes back to oral stories that were at a certain point in time reworked to create a uniform poem. And well, that did not prevent the oral traditions to continue. And one could think of a similar scenario for the Homeric epics, and especially if we allow an earlier introduction of the alphabet, some parts at least of Homer could also have been written down earlier, and that would explain a lot of the archaic elements that are still present in the Homeric epics. So in that respect, we could more see Homer as the product of a oral literate tradition, just like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I would like to conclude with a question raised by Jack Goody, the famous anthropologist who worked a lot on oral traditions. And to him also the Homeric epics simply did not fit in his idea of oral traditions. And therefore he asked the following question. Many have held the present version of the Iliad to represent an earlier oral composition written down at a later date. Is it not more likely to have been a written composition of that same earlier date? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Willemijn. As I was expecting, this is very provocative, very intriguing. I have noted down 10 questions. So oh, wow. If it were for me, we would be discussing this for hours and hours on end. I'm sure that our audience, which is very, very wide, will ask very intelligent questions, more intelligent than what I can do now. Can I just break the ice, actually, and start with the first one? You seem to suggest that the 11th century BC is the possible date for the origins of the Greek alphabet, which places us in a context which in Greece, as you very rightly point out, we have and not so dark, dark age. And there seems to be a great divide in the way that we look at the evidence, because Semitic experts seem to point for a much higher date for the origin of the Greek alphabet, whereas classicists point towards a much lower date, and they tend to be more positivistic and conservative. So this date of the 11th century really ties in much better with the Semitic cortes, the Semitic school of thought, which is interesting in terms of intellectual thought. But then the big elephant in the room is then, where would the alphabet have been created and developed? I know you mentioned, for instance, Woodard, with the possibility of the location being Cyprus, and Cyprus, as you very rightly pointed out, shows a lot of continuity, much more than the Greek continent in terms of literacy, from the 2nd to the 1st millennium. So you seem to have avoided or skirted this question a little bit. Where would this have taken place?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Guilty as charged. I did avoid this question because actually I think it's quite a very important question, but also a difficult one. And to be honest, I'm just not sure yet. I'm really hoping to pursue research on this, because there are various options you could think of. Maybe it's actually no. I would like to keep it.
To keep it open-minded.
Yeah. But I think especially if you, with respect to the vowel signs, I mean, it very much depends. I mean, for Semitic languages, it can be less relevant to note down vowels. And you see, for example, if they start to write down Indo-European languages, that then they use vowel signs. So you would think that that it may have been a language that first, or speakers of a language that needed vowels, so to say, that first came up with a really consistent use of these vowels. So that you could think somewhere in the, I mean, it has been mentioned for Il Jakobowicz, for example. He relates it to the hieroglyphic Luwian, to the Luwian speakers in Cilicia, which is an option. But yeah, I'm just.
Well, we need to juggle options on the basis of the evidence that we have. And it so happens that if you're right, the 11th century is a little bit of a land incognita, as it were, terra incognita, when it comes to really pointing the finger at one location as opposed to another. I have so many questions, but I see that Ignacia Diego, for instance, would like to ask one. And then we have Drew Longacre, who raised his hand. I may be asking questions later on. Please, Ignacy, fire out.
Hello. First of all, I want to thank you for this very interesting and very exciting presentation. I agree with you with the regarding the problem of chronology. I think that there is a very positivistic view. Generally, the chronology is generally accepted only in connection with the earliest document attested, and this is a very very positivist view. But I think we can accept a development that can be longer in the time. For me, the problem is your model of a alphabet with this Anatolian, Italic, and Greek as sister alphabets. No, this is very problematic because, for instance, in the case of Etruscan, you has emphasized, pointed out the fact that we have the sun and the sigma as an argument in favor of this different status of Etruscan alphabet. But I think this is a very weak argument. It's a very limited argument because, in fact, we can attribute the presence of sun to the contact with other Greek alphabets of a different type. For instance, the Achaean alphabets used also in south of Italy had this sun as the letter for the sibilant. So it is not impossible that the Etruscan alphabet has adopted the two letters for the two sibilant sounds in Etruscan, C, S, and Esh, from different local varieties used in Italy. And I think that for the rest, the Etruscan alphabet is clearly an alphabet from Eoic model. It is very difficult to build an independent Etruscan tradition, independent from Greek tradition. I think the arguments are very, very weak. And in the case of Anatolian, I think we cannot speak of an Anatolian as a whole. I think that Phrygian is a very similar alphabet to Greek alphabets. I think that the origin is the same. It's not an independent branch from a alleged mother or Ur alphabet. And in the case of Lycian and Lydian, I think the tradition is clearly Greek. The problem is Carian, of course. The problem is Carian, but it is a problem concretely with Carian and with Carian documentation. But I think that we cannot speak of an Anatolian as a whole, as a possible different tradition. And in the case of Palo-Hispanic scripts, I think that the origin is very different. It's a direct origin from Phoenician. I think it is true that many years ago, some scholars, Untermann and I myself also, were thought that this alphabet, this semi-alphabet or semi-syllabary, was also from Phoenician and Greek origin, with some influence of Greek. But the current opinion among scholars is that the Palo-Hispanic writings were directly borrowed from a Phoenician model, because for instance, the use of the vowel signs is different from the Greek tradition, and also we have a system with syllabic signs for the stops. I think this is a direct adoption from a Phoenician model, and this Ur alphabet as a intermediate step between Phoenician and Greek. For me, I think that the arguments are not very solid. In this moment, it is possible that we can find other evidences, but my current opinion is that we have not arguments enough to defend this. I think it's entia multiplicanda in this case. This is my opinion.
So forth. And first, let me clarify, it was a simplified model. So I completely agree that there's not one Anatolian alphabet. It was just for the sake of clear. So I mean, of course, the Carian and the Phrygian are completely different. And the same applies to the Italic alphabets, for example. It was more for simplification, more to sort of, but to get the general picture. But I completely agree with you with there. And with the Etruscan, well, I mean, if we also, I mean, in the current pattern, we have to, because we have both these sibilants attested, we have to assume now different, I mean, as you say, different alphabets, and well, because it's clear that the red alphabets are the most resemble the Etruscan, but I mean, there's not one we can pinpoint and say, that must have been the ancestor of the Etruscan. So you're right. I mean, in any case, in the current scenario, you have to assume different influences. And with respect to the Hispanic alphabets, I know that the current idea is that Phoenician must have been the ancestor, but that some say, there may have been some Greek influence. And especially with these vowel signs, it is of interest that the vowel signs that are the same also in the Hispanic alphabets are the sort of the basic vowel signs that are also used as matres lectiones already in the Northwest Semitic script. So you could see that these three vowel signs could maybe be like the sort of the core vowels. Mm-hmm. Because I would think I mean, if Greeks really were the inventors of the vowels, so to say, then you wonder why they didn't, because for the Greek language, the length of vowels is relevant. Why they didn't invent, for example, I mean, the omega is a much later development, actually. So you would wonder, I mean, if it were actually the Greeks who invented the vowels, wouldn't they have come up with a different system, especially if you think of that they used for poetry? It would have been maybe convenient to indicate length. So for me, but that's always the problem with the model. I try to show the model to make it insightful, but then there's always, I mean, it's very flexible. So I don't believe in also a very strict Ur alphabet, but more I would like to get away from Greek as sort of the center of it all, because I think some things also in case of the Carian, for example, might be better explained if you do not have to assume that everything went to a Greek intermediary.
Can I just chip in relating to that? Because in your chart, which you say is simplified, and we're happy with that, you don't mention Phrygian at all. And I wonder whether that was a sort of a thinking choice, as it were. How do you see the new evidence coming from Gordian in relation to the origin of the Greek alphabet? Because you seem to suggest that it's a completely separate tradition, right?
Well, I would say more like the sister thing. That, I mean, it's clear that the Phrygian and the Greek are related, but it's also clear that they're different. And well, I think talking about the Phrygian, but it's all. For example, you have some signs in Phrygian that well may also appear in the Hispanic. For example, the extra arrow sign that has been added, and you also have the letter 8, which represents F in the Lydian, which you also find in Etruscan. So, but well, there's quite some debate. Are these independent? Yeah. So you could say, well, if there really are shared innovation, it would also imply that the Greek did not play a role in this. No, but I would say the Phrygian is really more like a sister of the Greek alphabet, and especially now because we are now at 800, and if it's indeed, if Claude Brix is right by saying that it represents an already established tradition, then we're also, then we're in the 9th century at the latest. So yeah, so I would more say that Phrygian is a sister of the Greek alphabet.
Okay, great. No, I certainly espouse your shaking of the status quo and the necessity to be much more flexible when it comes to thinking of origins and relations, and the unthinking Eurocentrism that has tainted our reconstruction is really a point worth considering. We have Drew Longacre who raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you much. That was a very interesting paper. I enjoyed that a lot. Coming at it a little bit more from a Semiotics perspective, I had 2 issues to discuss. One, more just a brief comment, another question. So the first one, I guess, just as a little caveat with the use of vowel letters within the Semitic tradition, you have to start thinking about how early those actually come to be used and how relevant that might be for using that as evidence for some sort of parallel idea of written vowels outside of the Greek tradition. Because within the Semitic tradition, it kind of develops slowly and gradually, and the kind of fully developed vowel letter system that you might be familiar with later traditions is something that's quite late. So, I mean, it starts to gradually come, but I'm not sure how relevant it would be for suggesting that within there was kind of a parallel acknowledgement that vowels could also be written. The second issue was with the word divisions. I found it very interesting. I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on how you exactly see that scribal, that writing practice working, because even within the Semitic tradition, you have a very complicated dynamic where many of the earlier ones don't have word division. And then later on, you do have more word division in some of the later West Semitic scripts. And here you have in Greek, the reverse, where you start having these sort of dots and lines for word division. But then later in Greek writing tradition, the word division is dropped out and you get the scriptio continua. So it's not like there's a clearly consistent pattern or trajectory. I'm just curious how you navigate that.
Yeah, well, but I think, but completely right, and that's the problem that our evidence is simply so limited. But from what I understand, for Phoenician, you see that at a certain point they start to write continuously, right? And no longer. Well, there is one. I know there's one inscription which the date is quite debated whether or not it's late or early one. But I think within Phoenician, it's mostly written like in continuous script, right? In the later Phoenician, and we don't have these word divisions. Or am I mistaken there?
I'd have to double check. I think in one of them I was looking at earlier, what was it, Kilamawa or something, that one had word division. I'm just having to look at it briefly. I'm not a Phoenician specialist, but
no, I know there are one or two inscriptions, but then again, as always, the date is highly debated, but that overall, that But maybe, I mean, then I'm just misinformed, but that's, at least from what I understood, is that Phoenician is in the later period really mostly written continuously, and this use of word dividers.
Yeah,
No longer
Kilmawa,
present, but
I believe that one has dots as word divisions. I'm looking at an image now online from the West Semitic Research Project. So I think that one has word divisions. I know in the Hebrew tradition you have word division dots. So it's just a little complicated. I mean, I don't know the answer, just trying to say it's something that I'd like to see more fleshed out when we're trying to think about these actual specific writing practices and how they carry over. Just curious, especially with like Greek then shifting back to or shifting towards a scriptura continua. And I don't know, just curious. It's always so much evidence, and it doesn't always fit in a neat pattern. So just something to look at more and consider as you're thinking. I don't know how much you've looked into that particular aspect, but.
Yeah, but the problem is that the evidence is so limited. So you could say, well, we don't have any attestations of these dots and vertical strokes in Phoenician anymore, but it doesn't mean that they didn't still use it. I mean, but from what I understood, it's only, actually, I think I forgot the name. I only know of, well, actually, it's an Aramaic inscription, but in the case of Phoenician, but then please send me the reference that it was mainly, and that, I mean, I'm not the only one who has noticed that problem, that it's mostly written from right to left in continuous script, and that's quite a difference then from the first Greek inscriptions, if you assume that they took it over from the Phoenicians in the 8th century. But I'm happy, I mean, if there's still 8th century Phoenician inscriptions with word divisions, I would be happy to hear that.
Willemijn, the big question there is whether we could or should or ought to consider writing direction, diacritic, word dividers, things like that as inherently basic elements that constitute the essence of a writing system, or whether they are just fluctuating and oscillating regionally or by preference or tradition or whatnot. So that is a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, true. But I think, I mean, I'm sure you can also find parallels for the opposite, but overall you see that there is, that when existing writing systems are taken over, that like these scribal conventions such as direction of writing are taken over along with it. But I mean, that's not a universal law, of course, but it's not.
Indeed, I completely agree.
Yeah.
We have Amy or Ami in the chat who mentions Nave and the early date for the transmission of the alphabet, of course, but he or she wanted to add something. So Ami, please.
Well, I just, of course, I'm from Israel, from Jerusalem, and my teacher was Yosef Nave.
Oh, wow.
I assume you mentioned him in the beginning. I was not, I missed the beginning of your lecture.
Yeah.
Until the end of his life, he believed that the transmission of the alphabet occurred in the 11th century.
Yeah.
We now have many more, not many, but we have quite a number of alphabetic inscriptions in the 11th century that were discovered at Khirbet Kayafa in the Shefela, west of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem itself. We can see also that the stance, the direction of writing is not yet stabilized in this period. They can be written from left to right or from right to left. You know, it's not yet fixed. So, and there are a lot of similarities. I also want to mention that in my excavations, Tel Rehov in northern Israel, we found about 15 pottery sherds, Greek, from Euboea and Attica, dated to the 10th and 9th centuries. They were recently published together with chronological discussion based on radiocarbon dates in the journal Opuscula, you know, classical archaeology. And there we show that the traditional chronology of Greece is basically can be accepted from the protogeometric geometric periods. But this would not transfer, it would not change the idea that the transmission of the alphabet occurred in this, to Greece occurred in these early periods. The problem is, of course, that we miss Greek alphabetic inscriptions from this period. We have a gap. How do you explain this? probably refer to this question.
Thank you. I'm afraid the volume didn't work properly, so I'm not sure if I heard everything you said. But rest assured, yes, I did, of course, mention Joseph Nave because he's one of the main proponents of this idea for an earlier introduction. And if I understand correctly, your question is the fact that why don't we have earlier inscriptions if the alphabet was introduced earlier already?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, but that's the argument is well that they must have been written down on perishable materials, which, well, as we know, is most alphabetic writing scripts use perishable materials such as papyrus and leather, etc., and not clay, unfortunately. So we would have to assume that writing was going on perishable materials, which we know from other. Which we know that happened. We know that from other historical periods as well. And then that from the 8th century onwards, then we see that writing becomes used more extensively, also for other purposes. For example, for writing things in caves and on pottery. And then, well, because that's more durable material, therefore they have come down to us. And thank you for the reference for the 314 date. If I understand you correctly.
Okay, I just want to say that probably the transmission was directly from Phoenicia to Greece. Seem to have archaeological connections. We have this pottery from Euboea, from Attica, that was found in Tyre and Sidon, in northern sites in Israel recently. So there were direct relations from the end of the 11th century, 10th century, 9th centuries. There were some trade relations, perhaps through Cyprus, we don't know. Cyprus is less well represented in this trade. But probably there were direct relations, and so we don't need to look for an unknown language, as I saw in your model.
No, well, the idea is, I'm sure, of course, there were connections. I'm not at all disputing that. But I think that, well, I would think it would at least be good to explore the possibility, because now we have Greece really at the center, and that all alphabets that have vowel signs must have been derived from the Greek alphabet, and that creates a lot of tensions, and everything has to be done in a very short amount of time as well. So I would at least like to open up the idea that this may have happened earlier, and also sort of release Greece from this 300-year dark age, which is really remarkable, because all around writing was going on. As you say, they were in contact with people who were writing, and they had their own writing traditions for such a long time.
Okay, I have a very long list of questions in the chat, a very long message from Pippa Steele, who thanks you for the stimulating paper. She wants to say that Cyprus also experienced something similar to the alphabetic explosion, but without adopting an alphabet. In Cyprus, we see new inscription types around the 8th century BC onwards, including gravestones, political inscriptions, etc. And it's as if Cypriots were participating in a widespread Mediterranean movement in the nature of literacy, but they were not doing so without changing the writing system they were using already, a syllabic system. So Pippa agrees that it is a phenomenon that can be considered somewhat separate from the development of the alphabets themselves. I would rather people actually picked up the microphone and asked the questions, especially if they're very long. We have plenty, we have so many questions.
Yeah, but if I can, I think, and that's, so thank you for the remark, Pippa, and I think it's indeed quite clear that in the 8th century, a lot is happening, and in that respect, I'm quite attracted by this new chronology, which sort of would make this period wherein everything was happening a bit longer, which I think might also, explain some things. But at least I think it's quite clear that in the 8th century, certainly things are happening, and and they don't necessarily have to be related to the introduction of the alphabet.
And Ami and Pippa both are very right in stating that the role of Cyprus in these connections need to be placed in a better context. We have Stephanie Daly with a message on an alphabetic personal name incised on a clay tablet 1500 BC, and Yemen palm sticks dated to 900 BC with C14.
Yeah, it's clear that that alphabetic writing was used extensively all over the ancient Near East, and it's becoming more and more clear just how extensively and how early also already. So yeah, that's certainly true.
And then we have another question from Saul. What about the evidence from the sanctuary of Apollo at Eretria?
What about it?
What about it? So if you want to ask your question directly, we would like to hear more. We have no soul. What do you have?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have any camera. Thank you for the chat. It was really lovely to hear the model you proposed. No, I was just thinking, because I think it's interesting to see all those inscriptions in ceramic, where you can see both the Phoenician characters together with the Greek ones. So how will that fit in your model?
You mean inscriptions in Phoenician and in Greek?
Yeah, we have. Yeah. Do you know those ceramics from the sanctuary of Apollo, the Lephoros?
Of course, I'm not denying that there were connections with the Phoenicians, not at all, I would say. But I think the one does not exclude the other. I mean, they could still be connections with Phoenicians, even though they had already received their alphabet via different modes. So I'm not at all arguing that there were no connections with Phoenicians. Quite the contrary, actually. But for me,
what I mean is that maybe that means that in that moment, there was such transfer, regarding the writings. I don't know.
Yeah, could be, but but that's the problem with the evidence that we have. I mean, it could also maybe have happened at an earlier stage, of course. But
yeah, that of course. But that's the evidence we have. Yeah, that's a later one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Thank you.
Willemijn, I love it that your model is the thing that raised more questions than the actual redating of the origins of the alphabet, which is the hot thing here. We have Federico Giusfredi from Verona. Federico, would you like to join us?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, lovely to
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Willemijn, I really love the presentation. Well, I'm not a specialist for the evolution of writing systems, so my question is very generic and probably also a bit silly. I also had the impression that at a given point, the alphabetic writing systems became some sort of circulating technology that exists pretty much all over the Mediterranean. I always wondered if this very genealogical and interference-less model that models, not only yours, but all of them actually, that assume that there's a development of system X from system Y is really the way to explain everything, or if aerial interference of different varieties couldn't perhaps be more suitable to account for some of the problems and mismatches we find. And with this respect, this question occurred to me actually when Silvia Ferrara asked about the location of the diffusion from mother script to Greece, very possibly during an earlier date, as you suggest. I was wondering if we really need to find one location in which the system entered Greece, or if we can have more than one or more competing one that then can account for the different variants.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I quite agree. The idea that the alphabet was circulating much wider, and I'm sure it would have been very suitable for purposes of trade, for example. So you can imagine, indeed, that it was sort of a coin. And in that respect, yes, you're right. I mean, that's the model. I mean, I try to, in my still too static model, I admit already to show that it may not have been such a linear development. But you're quite right. I mean, if the script, for example, developed and spread via trade routes, etc. I mean, then we could have a whole different ball game. Yeah, but I certainly agree. And then in that respect, there may not necessarily have to be one location as well. I agree.
Thank you.
We have Charles Gates on word division in Anatolian hieroglyphs. Is there any? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, they are, yeah. So, but I'm not. Well, there's this whole debate also about the date of the, the Anatolian hieroglyphs, which I personally think is much older than is generally held. So maybe it's not a.
I love your two papers on they wrote on words and the origins of the Anatolian hieroglyphs. You really do shake things up, Willemijn.
Yeah, but that's sort of, there's a risk that I've sort of become the person who sees writing everywhere, even before. But then again, but I do think, but it's really to get away, because we're now sometimes so focused on what we do have, which is of course very important, but it can be, I think we should really open, especially because we know that especially in the case of Anatolia, we know that there were wooden scribes who wrote on wood, and also in the case of the alphabet, we know that it was written down on perishable materials. So actually, there is quite a lot of evidence that there must have been so much more, and there are so many chance found in other locations. For example, in Novgorod, that by chance we have these birth documents, and which change our whole perspective on the medieval ages there. So I think we should really be aware of the fact, I mean, how wonderful it is that we have so much, but that's actually, that I mean, there's so much that we do not have.
And the question is, well, we need to assume a stance of open-mindedness, even on the strength of new inscriptions coming our way, that force us to shake up the rigid parameters that we have set in 100 years for ourselves. Do we have any more questions? If not, I'm going to ask another one, if you don't mind, Willemijn. I don't want to take too much space. I was wondering about the development of the supplementals and the Cretan green alphabet in the sort of categories that have been created, and the relationship with phi and quoppa.
Yeah. And
quoppa being a pointer to a possible early transmission vis-a-vis the development of labiovelars. And I wanted to ask you whether we could correlate these two evidences together, which are quite dissonant, because on the one hand we have the Cretan green alphabet not having the supplementals, and on the other we have evidence for the phi being a pointer to the quoppa, and that would seem to contradict what we have for Cretan. How do you reconcile?
I'm thinking now, because I think there's this very intricate article, I think it's also by Greeks, right? Somebody who makes a very intricate linguistic argument for this, but I must say I'm racking my brains now.
But what do you think? Do you think that really the quoppa is a development or is related to phi?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't have a very strong opinion on it, but yeah, I certainly wouldn't exclude it. But do you have a strong opinion about it yourself? Or?
No, because this is why I wanted to ask you, because I don't find it particularly convincing, but I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to ask you. We have a question from Patrick Finglers, Professor Finglers.
Hello. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Willemijn, for an absolutely fascinating paper that's going to be having me thinking for a long time to come. Can I ask a question from the perspective of a Hellenist, and certainly not a linguist or a comparative linguist or an alphabeticist? You were talking about the fascinating possibility that there would have been this opportunity for writing to be used on perishable materials. I think you mentioned specifically in administrative contexts, as it were, before the non-perishable writing that we have in the 8th century. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about the extent to which there would be cause for such records in that period. Obviously, we no longer believe in a dark age where nothing happens for 400 years. The Lefkandi discoveries and so on help to undermine that view, and there's always more light being shed on this period. But we're still dealing with society that's not as complex as the Mycenaean palaces, with their obvious need for a script that's going to be necessary for all their administrative needs. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, and when and in what context. Well, I mean, we've already talked about place, but you know, what sort of time do you think that might have become necessary for the Greeks to have such a system?
Well, I would think primarily of the context of trade, especially if you're trading with literate people all around. I would think I would feel comfortable to have some sort of receipt myself as well. And yeah, it's a very tricky debate, because it is also the whole question about why is writing invented. But I think overall you can see, if you just look at archives that have been discovered by chance, that it's quite often that you see this need to record transactions or marriages. So I would see it in that sphere, basically. So the trade, but also could also be private things like a wedding contract or whatever. So, and even I think in less complex societies that there would be there could be need for that. But it's a hotly debated topic, especially, I mean, with trade, especially that we know that they were trading with other people. I would think that they would have made use of writing.
Sure.
Yeah.
So perhaps, are you envisaging more than private merchants, as it were, rather than being used in a centralized manner in the way of the Mycenaeans?
Yeah. Although I would not exclude that either, like for example city laws, to name something like that, or whether we have some, but it's all the evidence is not very concrete about this ponikastas in some inscriptions, that there seems to be sort of a town scribe or writer. So yeah, I would not. But that's the difficult thing with if there's nothing there that you can sort of speculate endlessly, and it's good to do so. But I would also not exclude more public use, for example, and
But that in, oh, sorry, Patrick, sorry.
I'm being greedy to come with a second comeback. I mean, with laws where you see those going up in Crete from a relatively early period, so Driros is mid-7th century and so on, would that not be a thing where we would really almost expect writing in stone from an earlier date, because it would be so much more durable and so on? Rather than, I can see why trade and contracts and so on, that might be on more perishable material.
That's also it's tricky. I think it's interesting for some people also ask me, okay, but so why didn't they write on pottery before, for example? And but if you look at the ancient Near East, where we have this very long cuneiform tradition, then if you look at the amount of inscribed pottery, that's really limited. And also, for example, the Hittite Empire only starts writing inscriptions quite late. So in a way that has to do with certain changes of tradition. So it's but you're right in a way that you can speculate, but especially in the case that we know that the primary material for writing alphabetic writing system is basically always perishable. I think in this case it would be fair to assume, but well, but you're right. There are things to think. These are things to think about. Yeah.
And we can always hope for that one stone inscription that's going to come up securely dated to 950 or whatever, and then we'll all remember where we were for this talk. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the lecture.
If I may interpose with this conversation quickly, this is Joanne Skurlock speaking.
Hello, hello, welcome.
I don't know how to work the chat thing, but in terms of Greek cities, and their laws, Sparta is peculiar in not writing them down. So we know there's a very long tradition of doing so. And there's one very good reason not to put them on stone. And that's that you can change them whenever you please. It costs a lot of money to put it on stone and set it up someplace. Usually there's a special reason in Athens for doing that. Otherwise, you leave it on paper and then you can change it whenever you wish to change it, which they do frequently. You make your own laws, your own customs. There's all kinds of things that are laws, like what you can wear and what you can eat, everything else. So, you know, there's an extensive coverage of this, way more than would probably fit or be appropriate on the stone in any case. So I wouldn't write out the possibility of plenty of written on parchment or something. It's going to be probably a valuable material, but it will be perishable. In other words, I mean, parchment is not, it could last for a long time if you put it, I mean, it's not perishable in the sense it's going to like evaporate instantly. It's just, it's a durable material. It's just not durable over a centuries, millennia, in unfavorable climates, not properly taken care of. Okay, so I just want to interpose, and then I wanted to ask make one quick comment or two, if I may, while I have the.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Rather than interjecting later. One has to do with the Homer issue, about whether writing was invented for Homer or whatever. The reason there are so many recitations from Homer in these writings is that Homer was actually used to teach writing, so that to people who were not literate. So not surprising, these things are all over the place, and a lot of people knew these phrases for that reason. And so it would be comparable to arguing that writing was invented for Gilgamesh because Gilgamesh is all over the place and there are many copies, et cetera, when in fact we know it's the other way around. Gilgamesh was used to train people in Akkadian. So anyway, that's just, and the other thing was the vowel issue. I think we need to be somewhat careful about that, because a lot of the texts that are written on especially on valuable materials like stone, have a big need for abbreviation so that you don't waste a lot of space and you can fit a lot more on there. And the first thing that goes when you abbreviate are the vowels. There are a lot of Latin inscriptions that are vowelless or practically vowelless in certain areas, because the abbreviation, which is the consonants with the vowels left out, will do just as well. So I think that just complicates life a little bit on the vowel issue, whether there were or were not ways of expressing in writing the vowels that we do or do not have, because yes, we are writing on stone or materials that have a space problem, and that you're going to leave out anything that absolutely doesn't have to be there. Okay, that's just what I wanted to say.
More complications. That's not what we want. No, but thank you.
It's my profession. That's what I do.
Yeah,
okay, anyway, just for thought.
Okay, we have Jeff Summers. Perishable material, talking of, the earliest Phrygian writing is from Tum MM at Gordian. This is on a wooden beam and on wax added to the rims of bronze balls. Willemijn.
Yeah, and it's always wonderful if this perishable, or as Joanne rightly said, perishable. I mean, for the long term. I mean, that's quite. You're quite right. That's some of these materials are not that perishable. But I mean, unfortunately, usually they don't survive for millennia. But it's of course wonderful. But I mean, in most cases, I mean, wood has not come down to us. So it's wonderful actually when we do have these examples actually with writing on them, and it's so yeah.
And wood is one of the examples that you use for your redating of the origins of the Anatolian hieroglyphs as well, with the
and which is I mean, especially in case of Anatolia we're talking about now. I mean, we know that it was quite thickly forested at this time. That was so it would have been quite an abundant and easily available material, and actually. Also worldwide, wood and also leaves actually of wood are quite common primary writing materials. I mean, maybe our view is a bit distorted because of the cuneiform tradition. There we have the clay, but it's actually worldwide quite an exceptional use primary writing material. I mean, usually it's like wood or leaves and that kind of material.
You have lots of congratulations in the chat, Willemijn. This has been a great success. Yeah. We pretty much reached Zoom capacity actually of 100 people, and I'm told that loads attended on Facebook, the live stream. We have Peter Pickering asking, why is there no reference to writing in Homer? We are expected to believe in an illiterate heroic age.
Well, there's a
reference to writing in Homer. Thank you, Pippa, for saying that too. That's what
there is actually, but I think the funny thing is, and it's a quote from I forgot his name, shame on me, who sort of lists a lot of very important epics worldwide where no writing, for example, the Aeneid, Virgil. There is no attestation of no mention of writing in the whole Aeneid, because basically writing is quite a boring activity. I mean, if you don't I mean, for example, the only attestation, or well, one of the possible 2 attestations of writing in Homer is the Bellerophon episode, where it is a letter with the death word, etc., where it's really a crucial element of the story. So then you need writing. But I mean, it's an epic about heroes and war. So basically, writing, I mean, it's quite a mundane activity in a way. So I think, I mean, there's a whole list of epics, so I can now only think of Virgil. But
Malugra, says Federico Giuffredi, very, very rightly. And then from Patrick Finglas, Iliad 7 too, where the Greek hero is marker token with the
I know.
forecasting. So yes, there is reference to writing.
But there's the debate: is it a sema, is it a sign, or? But I'm actually, I believe this must be a reference to a linear B, but not everyone's.
Oh, really?
Right. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question in relation to that? Out of
yeah.
Because in your sort of interface between orality and written traditions, you seem to suggest that yes, Homer must have been written down.
Yeah.
Much earlier than we have evidence for his poems having been written down. And I was thinking about asking you about Sarah Morris's articles on the narrative themes that are very Homeric being displayed in Thera, in Santorini, in Akrotiri, in the fresco program.
Yeah.
So what is your view on that? Because she seems to make a very strong connection, or suggest a very strong connection between the possibility of the Homeric epic being as early as that, and we're talking about late minor and 1A. So
that's really quite,
really
for me, actually, I think that's as you all know, there's quite some debate about it, but there's some, I mean, I think everyone has to agree that there are quite a lot of archaic elements, both in the language of Homer and also in the boar-tusk helmet and the shields, etc. That there really are archaic elements in there. And well, an important book is, of course, a catalogue of ships, which, according to most scholars, does represent more the Mycenaean world than the Iron Age, which are all. And especially, I mean, this catalogue of ships, which is, well, I think not the most exciting book of Homer, but it's quite long, and at least I think 178 ships, and it's quite extensive. It's not a very typically oral product to transmit. I mean, it's really, I mean, especially people like Jack Goody, for example, think that the whole concept of catalogue is quite a written thing, actually, that it's not very common in purely oral society. So, and especially such a catalogue of ships, I could imagine that it actually really was written down much. And I think there are indications that it's like a later insertion that is maybe not part of the original epic, but it may come, really reflect an older tradition, and that that such lists and such catalogues did circulate.
And they were written down. It wasn't just
And
the question is who used them. That is the big question. Who used them? What was the agency behind it?
But people tend to like catalogs. It's interesting, but you see it in the ancient Near East that some of the oldest texts are these lexical lists, etc. Apparently, people like putting things in lists and to bring order in the world. But it's I think that's also Foucault who addresses that quite extensively. But for me, but I know that it's a very. But I think it's quite interesting that if you look at the Greek history, their own perception of history, they don't see a dark age, they don't see a gap, they see the heroic age really as part of their history, and there's no really, I mean, so I sort of wonder, I mean, if there might not be something in it actually that, I mean, our view is so, well, in a way distorted by this idea that we have this dark age, and now, well, we know it was not as dark, and that there may have been much more continuity actually. And I think the fact that the Greeks themselves, the way they talk about their past, I mean, it feels like there's for them no interruption, but actually continuity. Mm-hmm. And we know from texts, I mean, there were discoveries of ancient texts. I mean, we know that you have these texts that mention like the discoveries of old bronze tablets with mysterious signs, etc. And well, I'm pretty sure they must have encountered their written past. If you think when Arthur Evans arrived at Crete in the early 1920s or so, I mean, he saw Cretan women wearing these hieroglyphic seals, etc., as jewelry, right? So I mean, if people in the previous century still discovered like written evidence of the Greek past, I'm sure the ancient Greeks themselves must have as well. So for me, it's not. So for me, I mean, yeah, actually, I don't see the Homer and the whole heroic age as illiterate necessarily. And if you look at the tragedies that are placed in the heroic age from Sophocles, for example, I mean, and they're all, I mean, there you do see frequent references to writing, usually the writing of letters, etc. So I think for the Greeks also their heroic age wasn't necessarily illiterate, and it was because we know they had Linear B.
Yes. Although Linear B wasn't used to write poetry, at least as far as we can tell. We have a comment from Professor Finglas again. In college, the professor kept talking about Homer's imagery, Homer's symbolism, etc. in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I would be sitting there thinking, look what Homer does with the ships. Robert Caro is known for as being the biographer of Lyndon Johnson. He wrote, I think, 5 books. Is it 5 books on Lyndon Johnson's life? So this is a fine appreciation of the literary qualities of the catalogue of ships.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for downplaying its importance, but but it's but I think hopefully we can agree that, I mean, even I'm sure it certainly has literary qualities, but it's not still not a very well, at least if I believe anthropologists, it's not a very common element of a purely oral tradition, so works that are transmitted and composed orally.
But there's hope if we have American historians being enthralled by Homer and his poems.
Yeah, no, and yeah, and I will reread the catalog tonight, I promise.
Okay, great, fantastic. Do we have any more questions? Any questions from the Inscribe group? That they're daunted by the prospect of having to speak. No more questions? Willemijn, I have one last one, since nobody's asking. You seem to suggest, but I'm sure that you don't suggest it, that writing ends up being invented or created or recreated as a result of a specific purpose. And this is my sort of one of the things that keeps me awake at night. You seem to want to categorize purposes and aims and finality, administrative, and then a more intimate setting, and there are more widespread usage that can involve poetry or not. I'm sure that you don't really see this in such a rigid way, because your presentation and knowing you, I know that you don't really subscribe to such a sort of an inflexible, straitjacketed way of looking at what writing can and does do. And by the same token, implying that writing, such as the Greek alphabet, was created to the end of teaching or learning, or writing down Homer is really a sort of a dead end, really.
Yeah.
So why was the Greek alphabet created?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, no, but yeah, to be sure, I mean, completely agree with you. That, I mean, it's but sometimes, I mean, you do try to, I mean, make it a bit less abstract, and then sometimes it's good to pinpoint, because I do think like that the pornographic graffiti is not a very evident primary use of writing. I think that for me implies that it also must have been used for other purposes. Yeah, but why was right? But that's I think, well, in general, a question to struggle with. I think, well, I know that you also worked on it. Why there? I mean, it's often said that, like, for administrative purposes, but it could also be for identity, of course. I mean, we're not really sure, and it's also, yeah, a debate in to what extent we should actually talk about the Greek alphabet, or if it's rather like a system that, well, was already in use and at a certain point also started to be used by the Greeks. And I think it's quite interesting that we now know that it already from the early 2nd millennium alphabetic writing was in use, because there's quite this sometimes still this persistent idea that there's some sort of a hierarchy in writing systems, and then that the alphabet is sort of the summum, like but it coexisted with other writing systems as well. So yeah, in that respect, you might say, is there really, or do you mean why did the Greeks take over the alphabet? Maybe then is that the question you're asking, or?
Yes. Why did they decide however many of them, however many groups? If Federico Giuffredi is writing, seeing it as a more decentralized activity or action.
Then I think I would go for trade, but that's I agree that that's not. I mean, it's difficult to say, but I think that would be quite a logical mode of transmission. But I completely, I mean, it is a guess and
no, I like the idea of shaking up the concept of administration being this uber functional need to drive and incentivize and push towards the creation or transmission or adaptation of writing systems. We have a comment from Jorge Cano Moreno. I really would like people to join in instead of writing in the chat. I wouldn't want this to be even more remote than it already is. I would like people to ask questions directly, but instead of reading them aloud. Given the fact that the next talk will be about Mayan script, it is quite interesting knowing that the collapse of the cities was not the collapse of literacy, but the collapse of central power and the more or less centralized way of depicting iconography and writing. The good thing is that the Spanish conquistadores arrived time after and record some of their traditions. Even today, the language and some part of the social organization, broadly speaking, is still alive. Do you want to add something to that? The fact
I think that's a very that's a valid observation, that indeed the collapse of a certain system doesn't necessarily have to mean the collapse of literacy. Although in some cases, if there's a strong connection with certain writing systems and the state, so to say, then you sometimes do see this relation. For example, if you think of the Hittite Empire, and well, possibly also Linear B, that you see as soon as these structures disappear, then at least that particular writing system that is also attached to the state disappears. But that, of course, does not mean that all writing disappeared. In this respect, I think also Hittite Anatolia is a good point in case, where you see that the hieroglyphic tradition, for example, does continue even after the fall of the Hittite Empire. Yeah.
Willemijn, I would love to invite you for another scribo on the Anatolian hieroglyphs, because I think it's a hot topic as well. And your ideas are very stimulating and interesting in terms of that too. Sorry, John.
Yeah, yes, just in terms of the answer to your question, actually, from the ancient Near East, there is actually a statement saying why they're writing things down, which might be interesting in terms of why they started writing things down.
You mean my question about whether...
Your question.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Analama she shatir, which means written down in order not to be forgotten. So when you get past the range of your own personal memory, there comes to be a need to record whatever it is that you need to remember. So that's what they said. So just for that.
Yes, and I totally espouse that very generic, broad-ranging idea that writing is just used to write things down, really.
Yes. So you don't forget them. If you can remember them, you don't need to write.
But we don't need a purpose or another for that to happen. It could be anything, really. My name, your name. I always tell my students, the first thing that you do when you learn a new writing system is what? Write down your own name.
Yeah.
So,
on a wall.
On a wall, on whatever you have. Thank you so much, John, for the suggestion. Do we have any more questions? It's been almost 2 hours. I'm very happy. I love these discussions. I would continue for hours.
If I may, just a small
Federico.
remark again on the ancient Near Eastern origin of writing, which basically means Mesopotamian origin of writing, I do agree that this view that administration is the trigger, the universal trigger, is probably an understatement of a much more complex phenomenon. I think this depends on the fact that it is true for Mesopotamia. I mean, if we go back to the late 4th millennium, there's a situation in which administration was basically reinvented after a big change of social and also environmental situations. And there, as a coincidence, at the same time, writing was developed. So probably it is a model that is still true for some specific situation in which a social renovation occurs at the same time as a writing system is developed. So I wouldn't really dispose of the relationship between administration and origin of writing in general.
Nobody suggested that, Federico. Nobody suggested that administration doesn't.
No, but it is also a follow-up. Of course, there is also this function of memory, which is very important for the self-representation and identity of the Mesopotamian culture, but of course is a later product with respect of the introduction of writing, which did occur locally and in that situation as a consequence, or well, yes, as a consequence of an administrative revolution. But of course, it would be really probably a bit naive to think that this should work also for other situations in which administration had been existing for centuries and that used different writing systems and needed by no means inventing a new one. So I see what you meant.
And the idea that writing was only invented in Mesopotamia once in the history of mankind.
Oh no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was
clearly it wasn't, but it's a view that has changed recently in the past generation. So clearly that one invention has colored the purpose and finality of all other inventions that we know are plentiful. Well, plentiful. How many? But definitely not relegated only to the Mesopotamian area. But going back to Greece and the origins of the Greek alphabet, is there any other question from anyone? Willemijn, are you still there?
I'm still waiting if there are more questions, but I'm still here.
Let's see. Any more? No. Okay, in that case, thank you so much. It was wonderful, very rich, very intense, and very stimulating. And I'm sure that many people will send you emails writing to you to ask ask for any enlightenment, further insight into the origins of the alphabet. But I'm penciling in your next invitation to Scribo for the Anatolian hieroglyphs. Maybe there's a question. Sorry, how did the Etruscan learn writing from the Greeks? Sorry, we have a in coda question.
3 minutes for
Rohan von Taduran. How did the Etruscans learn writing from the Greeks?
Yeah, well, if you're asking me, it's actually not necessarily a given that they actually learned it from the Greeks, because it may have been that they, I mean, if we assume that the alphabet was already circulating earlier, I mean, there could have been other modes of transmission, although looking at the, as already mentioned by Ignacio Diego, I mean, there is quite a strong resemblance between the red alphabets and the Etruscan. Yeah, so, well, I mean, that could have been also in the context of trade or in the context of, actually,
it's a whole other seminar in itself.
Yeah, maybe it's, yeah. But I would like to say please do also send me remarks and suggestions, because the problem is it's quite a big topic. I mean, and so I don't know all the ins and outs about all the italics alphabets, etc. So in that respect, that's always the danger if you're trying to make a model which is sort of encompasses more disciplines, then you're always at the danger of not being aware of the latest inscription that does have vertical word dividers, etc. So please, I mean, I'm very much open to suggestions, because I'm very much aware of the fact that
we have we have another question from Leopoldo Zampiccoli, I don't know. If Leopoldo would like to join us and ask a question live.
Yeah.
Anita, I was typing it. That was
no, please join in. No typing.
No.
No typing.
I was just wanting to ask on the need to shift paradigms of transmission, on the fact that also our knowledge of Phoenician is not particularly consolidated, and on the fact that the earlier attestations are not that many, and the fact that, for example, some of the longest inscriptions on which we base our knowledge of the language are not coming from Phoenicia proper, but from lands more up north, where the language in theory would have not even been spoken natively. So on the question of, well, in general, if it's that easy to suppose a direct connection between Greek and Phoenician in this model, or rather trying to see attestations also from other West Semitic realities. So it's in general just a point on the shifting.
So, but I mean that the Phoenicians may not necessarily have been the ancestors, the direct transmitters of the alphabet, or what are you?
The question was more in general, because, for example, among the earliest inscriptions, some of the earliest ones come from Syro-Hittite states, so in areas in which, in theory, Phoenician was not spoken. And there was actually also an article that was published last year on some inscriptions from Samal, in which the Phoenician is actually marked by some Luwianism. So there's also some influence, and our knowledge of the language is based on these inscriptions, but these inscriptions are not a completely safe and pure attestation of what was happening. And I was trying to look, but I didn't really manage to find where that was being said. But for administrative purposes, for example, in the Western Levant, some have supposed, but I cannot really find where I read it, but I'm sure I read it, that actually administrative practices were canonized with Aramaic and not with Phoenician. So that there have been also suggestions of that kind. And so also going back to what was being proposed before on the idea of looking at different orthographic practices and comparing them directly between Greek and Phoenician, the question is, how relevant is it that there's a direct correspondence between Greek and Phoenician in the early stages, or rather we should look at the more widespread analogies.
And certainly, and this whole comparing of individual sign forms is quite difficult, especially because our material is so limited. And I think, but it's an interesting point you're raising, because I think one of the main reasons why we are so fixed with the idea that it must have been the Phoenicians who introduced the alphabet to Greece is Herodotus, who talks about the Phoenicaia grammata, which he explains as being Phoenician letters, which you could also explain, for example, as palm leaf writing, etc. And I mean, it's obvious that there's a Semitic background of the Greek alphabet, but if it were necessary the Phoenicians, I mean, it's basically Herodotus, well, and the fact that we have Phoenician presence, but I mean, it's not actually so certain as we sometimes think it is, that it must have been the Phoenicians who were like really the ones who transmitted the alphabet.
There was actually, I was typing also that one in the question that I was asking, on the fact that Phoenicius itself is not necessarily, well, it's a term that has been coined in theory in Greece, and it's really hard to point down what it actually represented on the other coast of the Mediterranean, what standard for that specific term. Yeah. So also saying Phoenicaia grammata per se is not necessarily pointing to those specific cities.
That's true, and I mean, we have Herodotus, but there were there are also other views who said that we're not the Phoenicians, but the Syrians. Well, then we also have to wonder who they meant by the Syrians. But it's actually not. I mean, if you look also at the Greek traditions about the introduction of the writing, it's not really as clear cut as we sometimes think. I mean, I think we're very much colored by the account, the narrative of Herodotus.
Okay. Great, we are really shaking things up here. Poor Phoenicians.
Maybe it's time to stop.
The equation seems a little bit too brutal, at least. Okay, great. Willemijn, I think we are done with the questions. There is a comment from Yatex to Joanna, actually, Kerlock.
Hello.
Asking about
It's me.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's just a thing I was shy because it's not worthy perhaps, but I am really interested in a thing that Johannes Kurlock has said, but I'm not sure. She said that when you write something, you forget it. Can you? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Whoops. Yeah, no. What I mean is that you write it down. Okay, so let's say you have an appointment next Thursday, and you know you have a lot of things to do before next Thursday. So you write it down. Whereas if you think you can remember it, you don't. So
no,
that was.
I think the question is, what is the source?
Oh, what you mean? What? No, I think that. Yeah. Okay. Analamashe shatir is an expression I think that's used. You're hitting me with a footnote, and I would have to look that up. It's Assyrian. I think it might be Middle Assyrian, like administrative text or something. It says Analamashe shatir at the end of it. It's written down in. It gives it as a reason for recording it, that it's so as it not to be forgotten. But I'd have to look it up. Actually, if you look up in the CAD under Mashu, you might be able to find that. So yeah, to forget. The verb
okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, I can't give you a direct reference for it, but.
Great. If I could have Willemijn back to say goodbye.
I'm still here.
I did tell you, I did warn you that the discussion was going to be longer than the actual talk. It tends to end up that way, which it's much to my delight, actually, because I love long discussions and I really enjoy roundtables, and it's a perfect chance to sit down and think about things together, pondering. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation on behalf of the Inscribe team. I'm sure we'll see you again, hopefully live. I did forget to say that Willemijn has a big project in the pipeline on the alphabets of the first millennium BC. So we shall hear more from that end, and it's going to be a very fruitful direction for your research, I'm sure. Thank you so much. You're receiving loads of compliments in the chat, which means that this was a great success, and you had a big audience from the beginning. So I'm very pleased, and I'm delighted that you managed to take part, and I'm delighted that everybody participated so actively. All I need to do now is remind you that our next SCRIBO is going to be on the 29th of July, always a Wednesday, always at 4:30 p.m. Italian time. And we will have Christian Prager from the University of Bonn, the study of Mayan hieroglyphic writing in the digital age, a work report. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much, Willemijn. It was wonderful, very intense and very stimulating. I'm sure we'll hear more. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pippa. Thank you, everybody that took part. Thank you, all of our colleagues. It's wonderful. We need to build a big community discussing things together. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.